Welcome to ancient Greece. When most people think about Greece, they think about the temple ruins that are still standing today, which is really impressive and just goes to show you the durability of stone. Given enough time, however, these would eventually collapse. They would be eroded by wind and water, and there are tremors sometimes in Greece, and so eventually that would knock them down. But they've been here for so long that they have become part of our culture. We no longer think of this as ancient Greece. It's just sort of part of our modern idea of Greece, because it's still with us. I'm trying to get the next slide here. So when we look at a map of ancient Greece, if I can get it to switch over, Mount Olympus was actually one of the major cities, as opposed to now Athens is the major city. Also Olympia, Sparta. A lot of you guys are going to recognize Troy, Delphi. You're going to remember or recognize these names because we studied this as children in school. Today, if you go visit Greece, most of what's left from ancient Greece is now ruins, which you can visit. They've done a very good job of what's left, preserving it. This is Mount Olympus in Athens, and the Parthenon, right? So we're very well. The original image was the Parthenon, and that is a temple. And in fact, the whole Parthenon was a temple, was temples that were for their gods. The Greeks had multiple gods. Some of you have studied Greek and Roman mythology. I took an entire course when I was a freshman in college or sophomore, and it was really interesting. And so the Greeks had different gods, and Athens, Nike, Zeus, they all have temples here that were in their honor. And this is possibly what they looked like, or at least the Temple of Zeus looked like in its time. They did paint the buildings, so they weren't, they're gray now, but at the time they did whitewash and paint them, so they had color on them. However, we're not going to look at that. I always like to kind of start off with the stuff that everybody knows to provide connection. But ultimately, we are going to look at the residences. And this is a typical Greek residence. Now, obviously, like any society or culture we look at, there are different houses depending on whether you were poor, whether you were middle class, or whether you were rich. And this is more of a middle class or wealthy home. The people who were poor tended to live in rooms in other people's houses, or they lived in very small apartments, which is really not that different than what we still do today. Now, the Athenian home starts to take shape more like the way we live today. Family room, kitchen, dining room, bedroom. They obviously, family room, did I say that? They also had altar in a courtyard because they had a favorite family god, and they would have a setup for their god. They have a courtyard because the weather in Greece is amazing. So you can have an outdoor courtyard year round, where you can have a water feature and hang out and relax. And it's just kind of similar to the way we do backyards now. And here's a piece of a floor room for those who lived in the city. They tended to live in bedrooms off of a courtyard. It was an atrium and a courtyard, and they shared space. So bedrooms that shared an atrium, shared a courtyard, shared a kitchen, bathroom. The Greeks did have bathrooms in the sense that their plumbing wasn't quite the same as the Romans. The Romans are the ones we're going to really talk about bathrooms with, because the Romans really are the ones that gave us the modern bathroom. So if you were wealthy, your residence could look like this, which didn't look much off of a temple, which is kind of why it's interesting to look at the temples initially. And then when you look at the homes of the rich and famous, they clearly favored themselves to be gods themselves. Now, if we look at modern um, in Athens, if we look at modern residential building design, it still has a very similar on-grid formal structure. Things are white because it gets very hot there, so stone is very abundant, it's very cheap. Marble there is way cheaper than it is here. Here's another one, modern residence. Excuse me. Isn't that cool? But a lot of white. All right, so Knossos was a Minoan city that has since crumbled from earthquakes. But parts of it are still standing, and it was originally that color. That recently fell, so you could see how they painted their buildings. Floor plan of Knossos, and it was a city. It was but it's on an island on Crete. I actually visited it. It's mostly in ruins. It's mostly rubble. As you can see, most of it's rubble, but there's still some of it that's still standing. And it's these pieces that are still standing you can see. Here's another image, another example of it, where you can see the excavation, and that part of the building is still standing. This is what it's believed to have looked like at the time. So a small but really pretty modern city. I mean, even you modernize that's still a good design. Some of the interior design. The Greeks tended to use a lot of tile. You see a lot of tile work done in Greek architecture. And then, of course, the terminology. There's a lot of terminology we have gotten from the Greeks. Facade, which is the exterior of a face of a building. And then there's just sort of a dissection of a temple, so you can see the different architecture on there. And a lot of all this, like cornice, I know you guys have probably heard the term cornice, frieze, architrave, all that came from the Greeks. That's when they began to create what is known as an order, and we'll get to that in a second. They went through painstaking detail to define how their building components would go together. And it's very ordered. And so there are 5 main orders of architecture: Tuscan, Doric, Composite, Corinthian, and Ionic. And it just describes, as you can see when you look here, how the tablature of each column and support gets put together. And also up here, whoops, I skipped one, sorry. Okay, so the Doric order, and I'm going to let you guys go through this. This is something you should learn because these columns are still used today. They're still with us today. These styles are still with us today. Doric was first, and then there's just some examples of what it looked like in details. Ionic, it's always got the little scrolls on the volute. And you can see architrave, frieze, cornice. We still use these things today. More examples. And what's pretty interesting is you can see that they incorporated different cultures into the Ionic volute. Then the Corinthian order, and you will see these throughout the South on Baptist churches. In fact, that's where the name is connected. Some examples. And they always had these cool acanthus leaves. It was a perennial shrub native to the Mediterranean, and that's where those come from. So it's kind of interesting when you grow up around this and you don't know the history of it, and then you see the history of it, and it's kind of interesting. And these can get really wild with how much detail. You could put a horse in there. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Ionic volute. Tuscan order is very clean and very simple. And it's just a variant of the Doric order. You'll see this around a lot. This is very common in current architecture. Um, yeah, just lots of examples of the Tuscan order being used today in residences. Okay, and so essentially the Greeks gave us modern design. We haven't strayed far from where they started us off in terms of how we organize our houses. Of course, we have more modern facilities, but I'm trying to scroll back and talk at the same time, and I'm starting to trip over my own tongue. Here we go. I was going to go back to this. Yeah, I mean, they gave us traditional houses and that we still continue to live in today. Okay, I'm going to end this here, and I'll see you guys in Rome.